Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Hi, I'm Beth Parker, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. When we look at governments in disarray, where people are at each other's throats and find no remedies, we have to ask, well, what does work? I'm wondering if we're wise enough to look outside the box to be creative with our solutions. We hear constant criticism of socialism in our conversations, but when I leaned in and asked, well, what is socialism? I got everything from, well, it's like shared medicine and Social Security, to it's like Russia, to, well, I really don't know. In this episode of Ethical Perspectives, we'll focus on definitive answers. We'll talk about socialist activity here in Iowa and about consequent interactions and implications for Iowans as world citizens. Our panelist this evening is a member of the Socialist Equality Party. Jerome White, how shall I address you?
Oh, that's fine. Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you, Beth. Yes, my name is, I go by Jerry White, and I'm a member of the Socialist Equality Party and the labor editor of the World Socialist website, which is the international publication of our movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International.
Thank you. Lots of questions, lots of information to go over. It sounded like you would like to start talking about current strikes from the companies CNH in Wisconsin and Iowa, Chevron in California, Arconic Aluminum in Iowa and Indiana and Tennessee, Detroit Diesel in Michigan, Twin Cities, Twin Ports, and nurses in DC. That's a lot of fired up folks. Would you like to give us an overview of what's going on in the country?
Well, there's certainly immense social anger over the surging prices in fuel and food, inflation rate at 8.5%, a pandemic which has cost the lives unnecessarily of more than 1 million people, while the private fortunes of America's billionaires have risen by 70%. Corporations making the highest levels of profits since the 1950s, and a growing movement of the working class in the United States and around the world. Workers cannot live under these conditions anymore after seeing their living standards decline for decades. So there's a growth of struggles. The CNH workers, the Case New Holland workers in Burlington, Iowa, and Racine, Wisconsin have been on strike for a month. The aluminum workers at Arconic in Burlington, Iowa, and other states are voting tomorrow on a contract brought back by the United Steelworkers Union, which will do nothing but establish a real cut in wages. Railroad workers at BNSF, hospital workers, a growing movement of the working class. And in all of these struggles, workers are in a direct conflict with the giant corporations, which are backed to the hilt by both Biden and the Republicans, Democrats and Republicans, and also by the trade unions, which decades ago abandoned any defense of the rights of the working class and have been transformed into the tools of corporate management, not to improve the living standards of the workers, but to impose the dictates of big business. So we see this strike wave, which is growing in the United States, as part of a global struggle of the working class. Railroad workers in the UK have gone on strike. Healthcare workers in the small island of Sri Lanka off of the coast of India, there's been a month-long struggle to remove the government over surging prices and so forth. And all over the world, the working class is coming into struggle. And what we're fighting for, from the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Socialist website, the International Workers Alliance of rank and file committees, is to unite all of these struggles into a common struggle. Oppose all of those who try to pit workers in America against workers in other countries. All workers have the same interest. And it's not in fighting wars like the US proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, but it's in a class war to put an end to inequality, to guarantee the necessary resources, a reallocation of society's resources into the hands of the masses of working people who actually produce society's wealth. And that's the program of socialism that we fight to bring workers in all of these struggles and develop new forms through which workers can fight, independent of the old corrupt and pro-company unions.
Speaking of unions, I just want to elaborate on that for a minute if we can. A friend of mine, I spoke to her, and she spoke of unions in her mother's era. She was talking about 1939 when her mother was a teacher and whose offered contract was contested and then fortified and much improved because of the union. So has there been a change in unions?
Well, of course, in the earliest period, in the 1930s or even before, the biggest impulse for the development of the organization of workers was the socialists, who fought to unite workers, immigrant, native-born, black, white, against all of the use of violence and use of racial and ethnic divisions that were employed by the ruling class. And there were powerful struggles, including in Iowa, many struggles of the working class. And after decades of repression, state repression, injunctions, the frame up and even execution of the leaders of the workers' movement, like the leaders of the 8-hour day movement in Chicago, workers finally made a powerful breakthrough in the 1930s. And millions of workers were inspired in the United States and all over the world by the fact that the Russian workers had taken political power out of the hands of the capitalists and began the road towards socialism in the Soviet Union. So millions of workers inspired by these great events waged powerful struggles, including sit-down strikes in the auto factories, the rubber factories. They actually seized the private property, frightened the hell out of the powers that be. And these were great achievements won by the working class. But right from the beginning, the question was posed: which direction would this new labor movement go? The socialists and the Trotskyists, those that were the followers of my movement that led the great strikes like in Minneapolis in 1934, they were fighting for the development of this movement in a political direction, the building of a mass labor party, a political party whose aim would be to establish a workers' government and to reorganize society, oppose war. But the leaders of the new CIO movement were opposed to that. They tied this new labor movement to the Democratic Party, to the support of war, to American nationalism. And by the late 1970s, as American capitalism was losing its competitive position in the world, as corporations now had the power to use globalization and shift production to different parts of the globe for cheaper labor, the unions abandoned any resistance against this attack on the working class. And they became incorporated into the structure of big business and the government, and they imposed wage cut after wage cut, and they were transformed from organizations that pressured the corporations and the government for improvements for workers into organizations that pressured the workers for concessions. And millions of workers lost their jobs. The unions found new avenues. The auto workers union began to own corporate stocks. They became businesses, the United Steelworkers, the United Food and Commercial Workers, led by union officials making hundreds of thousands of dollars. And in the strikes that I've mentioned, and really over the last decades, every struggle of workers has come into a direct conflict, not only with the corporations, but with the trade unions. And our movement is fighting for the development of rank and file committees, democratically controlled by the workers themselves, and committed to defend the interests that workers have and their families have, for good wages, for an end to exhausting and dangerous levels of overtime, for workers' control over health and safety, including COVID protections. That is, rank and file committees that begin with the needs of the workers and don't accept the, quote, management rights, the rights to throw workers out of their job, to cut their wages. And this is part of a fight that we're developing that unites American workers with workers around the world. I mean, over the last 20, 30, 40 years, the unions have told workers that our enemies are the Japanese workers or the Mexican workers, that rather than uniting with workers around the world against transnational corporations that operate everywhere, CNH is actually an Italian-American conglomerate. Rather than uniting workers in a global struggle, they pit workers one against each other. And the unions today are the biggest promoters also of war. The Biden administration knows that it is unpopular, that workers are concerned about inflation and eroding living standards. One of the major reasons behind the escalation of war against Russia, a nuclear-armed power, is to try to reverse the decades of economic decline, to try to beat back Russia and China, but also to try to divert social anger in America divert it towards an external enemy. The American workers, our enemies, are not the workers in Russia. The workers in Russia and Ukraine, in fact, have the same interests. Workers all over the world have the same interests. And we're fighting to build an international workers' alliance of rank and file committees which will coordinate the struggles of workers. During the deer strike, we assisted workers in Iowa and Illinois and other areas in building such rank and file committees, in appealing to workers in Germany and Britain and other countries in a common international fight against the attacks that workers all over the world are facing.
Bringing it home to here in Iowa, from the 1920s and then at least through the John Deere strike of 2021, socialists have been active in Iowa. Can you talk about that evolution?
Well, socialists have played a very big role. I think actually I learned about the role of German immigrants who came to the United States after the Revolution of 1848, a great upheaval to fight against the domination of monarchies. And many of those workers and leaders who were exiled, they were including the friends of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels themselves, people like Joseph V. They came to the United States. Many of them came through the port of New Orleans, and at first they were the supporters of the Mexican-American War tried to recruit them for the war, but these 48ers, as they were known, didn't want to have anything to do with the Mexican-American War because it was a war being driven by the interests of the slave holders to expand their territory. And they took steamboats from New Orleans all the way up to Davenport, Iowa. They played a powerful role in the abolitionist movement. They played a powerful role in the emerging socialist movement. And this had great influence. There was also powerful movements of the farmers, the populist movement in the 1880s, the progressive movement, other movements that developed, which united immigrant, native-born workers, the struggle against the use of racism to divide the workers. And so there's a rich history throughout Iowa, throughout the Midwest, for socialism. But of course, the ruling class fears nothing more than socialism and has endlessly propagated anti-communism because they feared. I was going to read from a historian, just one quote. His name is Nick Fisher, and he wrote about the role of anti-communism in the United States. He said, anti-communism often expressed the primal fear that the forces of communism might succeed where all the previous doctrines and people's movements had failed, where progressivism, populism, free silver, homesteads, free soil, redemption, reconstruction, and emancipation fell short, communism might triumph. Under its banner, the huge urban and rural proletariats might sink their differences. So too might white and black laborers and sharecroppers, native-born and immigrant factory hands, Catholics and Protestants and Jews. Here was the nightmare. That is what the ruling class has lost sleep about for well over a century and a half. And of course, when Trump denounces socialism, and the Democrats themselves join, we're not socialists and so forth, they fear that this growing movement of the working class will be fused with the great ideals of social equality, with the scientific understanding of the nature of the capitalist system as a global system, and that none of the problems that challenge humanity, inequality, the pandemic, the climate crisis, the danger of war, none of these can be resolved outside of the working class taking political power into our own hands, reorganizing economic life based on a scientifically and democratically drawn up international plan. So all of the great advances in human technology, human productive capacity can be organized to produce such a surplus of wealth that the very idea of poverty and inequality will be banished to antiquity. This is not a fantasy or a utopian ideal. Socialism arises out of the very contradictions of capitalism. The fact that we live in a global society, interconnected economically, yet under capitalism, the world is divided into competing nation states that fight against each other for control of raw materials, that pit workers against one another. Only the International Organization of Economic Life can organize society's resources in a rational fashion. The other thing is that billions of people take part in the social process of producing society's wealth. But everything is subordinated to the ever-increasing wealth of the billionaires and multimillionaires who produce nothing. I mean, Biden often says that, you should seize the ill-gotten gains of the Russian oligarchs. What about the ill-gotten gains of the American oligarchs? Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, people, pandemic profiteers. What about the Tyson Food Company, which allowed the pandemic to spread so much that in the Waterloo, Iowa plant, the managers were betting on who was going to get COVID next. So the organization of economic, social life based on a rational plan is not it's an absolute necessity. It isn't a utopian dream. It is the only way mankind can get out of the dangers, in fact, of world war. And I just want to make that point. Our party is totally opposed to the massive armament that the Biden administration, they've used the Ukrainian people essentially as cannon fodder. While we totally oppose Putin and his reactionary invasion, the fact is the Russians were lured into this over decades of NATO expansion. And the policy of the US government was to draw Russia into a bloody war. They're now giving the Ukrainians missiles and weaponry which can be fired directly into Russia. And mankind is now confronted with the danger of World War III with a nuclear power. Workers all over the world have no interest in that. We have an interest in peace, equality, genuine democracy, and democracy cannot even exist under a situation where a handful of billionaires control society's wealth. And that's why we're developing the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, along with our sister parties around the world in the International Committee of the Fourth International, and why we write the World Socialist website, which is the most read socialist website on the internet. I want to put a plug in for it. That's wsws.org. Thank you very much. And I urge all your listeners to go to our website, to contact us, and to help build the Socialist Equality Party in Iowa and wherever else your listeners are tuning in from today.
Well, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. I'd like to discuss a digestible form of socialism. It sounds so kumbaya, everyone making and implementing decisions. How does it work? Can you speak on the alliance of action committees that focus on the strategies to get everyone involved?
Well, it's a very good issue. Actually, our comrades in Sri Lanka are fighting in the present situation where the Rajapaksa government is imposing the dictates of the World Bank and the IMF. They're organizing rank and file committees and saying that these committees, which are organized in the factories, in the neighborhoods, in the schools, on the plantations, the rubber and tea plantations, these committees, which are democratically controlled by workers themselves, have to organize the distribution of food, the distribution of resources. These are workers, port workers, plantation workers, and others who are engaged in the critical production and logistics necessary for life. And these committees have to be the basis for the establishment of a workers' government. And it's the same thing within the United States. In every factory, in every neighborhood, in every school, workers have to build up these democratically controlled committees where there's genuine discussion, free and open discussion, where the needs of the workers for decent wages, to guarantee the right to health care for all, to guarantee high quality education, to put an end, to carry out a policy of zero COVID, to eliminate the pandemic. This is the actualization and the mobilization of the vast social power of the working class, which produces all of society's wealth. Nothing moves without railroad workers, without truckers. Nothing is produced without steel workers, auto workers. No electricity or any other critical infrastructure, construction workers, hospital workers, all of the workers that this pandemic proved we, the working class, are the essential force within society. The Bezos, the Musks are not essential. In fact, the rich are ruining everything. They're driving up the prices. Inflation is directly the result of the trillions of dollars poured in through the CARES Act and the bailout in 2008 to bail out the banks and the corporations. That is what's destabilized the whole economic life. We say the ill-gotten gains of the ruling class must be seized, reallocated to meet the needs of society. Look, we have a situation where a company like Abbott Laboratories had no concern over safety, allowed bacteria to spread in baby formula. Now, how many millions of women don't have access to baby formula? And the answer that Pete Buttigieg, Transportation Secretary, he says the US government is not in the business of producing baby formula. This is capitalism. Well, he's right. It is capitalism, and it's failed. It's failed. 1.5 million people have died in this pandemic. There's a danger of world war. There is such a promotion of violence and militarism, efforts to tell young people they have no hope, that you see these horrific explosions of homicidal violence like we saw last week in Uvalde. Capitalism is done. And the working class has to build a mass political movement in the United States, along with our brothers and sisters around the world, to put an end to it and to reorganize society on a far higher level. That is socialism, international socialism.
How does a population with such nationalistic indoctrination begin to conceptualize the benefits of socialism? How do we dissolve the misinformation that circulates regarding capitalism? And it looks like we're running out of time, so we'll keep going as long as we can. But
Well, of course, the American population is made up of workers all over the world, and the world is becoming a much smaller place through technologies that allow workers to communicate, young people to communicate. When the police murder of George Floyd took place, the Democrats and Republicans who never failed to say American society is divided by race. Well, you had millions of workers and young people, black, white, and immigrant, marching together, including in Cedar Rapids, to oppose police brutality. The working class gravitates to unify. I mean, we're all working in multinational corporations, but it's the Democratic Party, the endless promotion of racial politics, the claim that workers are the central divide is race. No, the central divide is class all over the world. And American workers have every interest in uniting with our brothers and sisters around the world. And that's what the World Socialist website is fighting to do. The International Workers Alliance of Rank and File Committees. And we urge your readers and your listeners to come to our website, the World Socialist website, WSWS.org, to find out about and join the Socialist Equality Party.
Let's talk about the election coming up in a few minutes, kind of wind up and talk about the elections coming up and also what the takeaways are.
Well, I mean, look, you have a Republican Party, which has emerged essentially as a fascist party that sought to carry out on January 6th a coup to block a democratic election. But Biden's response to the Republicans is to say, these are our friends across the aisle, to promote the Republican Party. And now through the war drive against Russia, to join with the Republican Party. Democracy is not possible under a society so divided by social inequality. So in our view, yes, the Democratic Party, once again, I just want to make one last point. The Democratic Socialists of America, the people like AOC and Sanders, they all supported the $40 billion in war funding for the Ukraine and the escalation of this war. They have nothing to do with socialism. We're fighting to bring genuine socialism to the working class, which is based on the fight not to appeal to the powers that be, but to organize the great mass of working class people to fight for political power and peace, international collaboration, and socialism.
Can you give us the 1-minute spiel about your path to socialism?
I was a young worker at UPS in New York City in 1979. I was also a student at the City University of New York, which in the mid-70s for the first time introduced tuition. There were protests that had been a right to free college education until 1975. I was politicized in a period which then, shortly after I joined the movement, Reagan fired the air traffic controllers. I participated in the struggles of workers. I saw the collapse of what was once the American labor movement and fought for the development of a new strategy, a political international strategy for the working class. That's a brief account.
Jerome White, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Beth. I appreciate you having me on this evening.